Welcome to another edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. We have on the show today Dr. Pat McKee Velasquez, and my name is A'Jamal Byndon. I'm the chair of the board of Movement Omaha for Race Equity. And we're going to have a conversation, a series of discussions where there's some current issues and issues that are impacting our community, and we're really concerned about how we should address them. And we have a number of topics we're going to cover, and hopefully throw out some light about issues we should be helping other folks and people to help deal with related to Latinos, African Americans, and people of color, and so on, not only on the global level, but also national in our local communities. Patrick, first start off a little bit, and I'd like to let some people who've never maybe met you and I, anything you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a retired Chicano educator living in San Diego, California, right on the U.S. border with Mexico. And I'm the grandson of Mexican migrants that came to the United States in the early 1900s. I live in San Diego now, but I was born and raised in Omaha. My family was one of the first Mexican families in South Omaha. And I've been in the education area for decades. Where I met you was in our master's program in education at the University of Nebraska, where I earned my master's degree. And after moving to California, I earned a PhD in higher education. And I worked at the University of California, San Diego, for 28 years. I was a part-time faculty in their education studies department and also a student affairs manager full-time. For those that don't know, the University of California, San Diego is one of the most racist institutions in the entire country. And so I saw a lot of struggles there during the 28 years that I was employed there. And now I'm, as a retired educator, one of the co-chairs of the San Diego Chicano Latino Concilio on higher education.
Okay, good, good. I think we're going to start off. We're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to switch back and forth in this interview, and I think we have a number of talking points and questions we're going to raise to each other. But I'm going to start off, I think, Patrick, I hope I got this right. Immigration policy, the whitening of the U.S., questionable asylum, things like that. And one of the things that we've talked about over the years and what goes on in Cuba, I know you've been to Cuba over 10 times. You very much are familiar with some of the residents as well as you're into the music. And now we have the current administration, the previous ones are doing deportation of folks. I also heard from you at some point that under President Obama, he had some of the highest deportation numbers that we knew about. But I guess it was hidden from some of us because many of us who were pro-Obama thought he was much more progressive. So my question somewhat is, we got this whitening of the U.S. Policy going on now and so on. What should we be about dealing with that? How should we address those questionable issues, and particularly some of the deportation that is somewhat humane, where you're taking people to places where they've never been? How do you think we should deal with that? What's your reaction to some of those issues?
I'm speaking not as a lawyer. I'm not an immigration attorney. I'm not an expert on immigration. I have been following immigration policy at a distance for decades now, all the way back to the 1986 Immigration and Control Act, which was legislation that was signed by President Ronald Reagan, one of our all-time most racist presidents. But he signed that law that allowed for the legalization of many immigrants, including many from Mexico. So I was involved a little bit about in that when I was working as a director of a nonprofit agency, and I helped people legalize their documents to be in the country and become legal residents. So I followed policy, and of course, again, living here in San Diego, right on the border. So I turn on my local news every night and see some story related to immigration and what the trends have been. So it's relatively easy to follow here. And as I told you before, I was just in Omaha visiting a few months ago in October, and I was really struck by all the fear and xenophobia on the part of white folks in Omaha about a border that exists so far away from them that it should practically be out of their imagination. Yet they were preoccupied with this, and I think this is part of the national profile. As we talk today at length about the policies of the Trump administration, we know that immigration was one of the main concerns of his followers, the people who voted for him. And so the important thing I think to keep in mind is that the reason why so many people voted for Trump, and especially that demographic we keep hearing about, the non-college educated white folks who are a very dangerous, toxic mix of ignorance and stupidity both. And so their main concern is the preservation of white privilege, which keeps them in a position where they gain unearned privileges. And if you look at studies of whiteness and ethnic studies, this is what we learn. No? So unfortunately for them, as they say, the horse has already left the barn. So if they're concerned about the demographic, particularly Chicanos, people of Mexican origin, outnumbering them or gaining political power in some locales equal to theirs, it's a little bit too late to close the door now. So because if you look at the demographics, and certainly I see this here in California, Latinos, Chicanos, and other Latinos outnumber whites in the state of California. And our population increases at a significantly higher rate than the white population. However, what contributes the most to that population growth for us is a higher birth rate. It's not immigration that contributes the most to the growth in Chicanos, in the Chicano population. It's that, quite simply, Chicanos have bigger families than white folks. And that's probably not going to change anytime soon. So they can do everything they can to seal up the borders. Contrary to what we hear, they are not concerned about fentanyl. They're not concerned about any illegal things being taken across the border. They're not concerned about immigrants from China or the Ukraine. In fact, they like more white European immigrants. But they're most concerned about immigration from Mexico and Central America.
Wow.
And during the Biden administration, Mexicanos were the ones least likely to be granted asylum, least likely to be allowed to stay in the United States. So even Biden imposed that anti-Mexican xenophobia. That's continuing under the Trump administration, only much more so. The the policy that has given favoritism to immigrants from so-called socialist countries like Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua was highly misplaced. And Trump has, I believe, eliminated all that, which is probably a good thing because, as you said, I've been in Cuba. I was just there last April. There is no threat to anybody's safety in Cuba. In fact, it's one of the most safe from crime and so forth. It's one of the most safe countries in Latin America, in this whole side of the world. There are no gangs in Cuba. There are no street gangs. The government does not allow that, unlike here in the United States, where the government allows Chicano gangs to run rampant in our neighborhoods without enforcing the law. They like that. So it never made any sense to put those Latin American immigrants at the front of the line for entry to the United States just because they came from countries that had a socialist economic system. So those are some of the dynamics that you see. And what you said, A'Jamal, is very true, man. The Biden administration, just like the Obama administration, deported as many people as anybody in the United States history, any president. So, yeah, progressive should not be used in the same sentence with Joe Biden.
Right. You know, the other thing, just a side note that hit me, I was reading an article today where Al Sharpton went off and talked about now we're going to bring these white South Africans over here, but we're going to deport Mexicans and Haitians. And it's the same reason that we look in terms of the racism that this country has had. Again, if the country doesn't practice discrimination, those are blatant cases. They're basically the people who live in Haiti and who come from Mexico and many other countries, they suffer asylum and also refugee status, and they have a higher wait time. And again, all of a sudden, he's going to let them get in front of everybody else, as well as the issue of letting millionaires and people who have lots of money to invest in the country. So he's taking a pro-business choice. But again, if people did a pro-business choice back in the day when the Europeans come from Ireland and elsewhere, many of those low-income white folks would never got here. Can you imagine if Native Americans sat on the shores and say, you have to have so much money, gold, before you come to our continent? And it's even like recently, the clowns just to enact the mentality of English as a first language or only language. And I would say, what about the Native Americans or Latinos who was here before all these Europeans got here? If you look at Central and South America, the indigenous Indians in those areas who spoke their native language, why don't we go back to that? But it's again, it's the same stupidity and asinine mentality of a person who has a deviant personality and who's just not well upstairs. It's obvious.
Yeah, and as you said, man, it's just feeding the base. So those non-college educated whites and a lot of colonized people of color, unfortunately, it's one of the saddest things to see people with these blacks for Trump T-shirts or Hispanic Trump hat. But again, we know how deeply colonialism is internalized by some people in our communities, and that's just a sad fact of life. One of the other things, Jamal, that I know has come out of the Trump administration has been virtually the elimination of USAID. And so I wanted to ask you your thoughts about that, and including the what seems to be so far the end to humanitarian aid for developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and so forth, and what you think about that.
When I was in the Peace Corps, we had a number of USAID workers, and there's some pitfalls with the program, but you got people who are suffering from HIV, hunger, medical issues, disease immunization, and USAID is a much more effective manner of helping families in these developing countries. And secondly, if you treat and you deal with some of those issues, you don't have that pull-push theory of immigration. People stay where they're at because, again, if USAID is doing their job, and I will say majority of them who work there are white folks. There are very few people of color working in that organization again. But at the same time, if they have non-governmental organizations working with other countries or individuals in that countries, they can direct those direct funding to feed people. Because again, I saw something on one of the shows recently that if we look at the top 1% of incomes in the world, they said you can make $31,000 if you look at all the global income. So you can imagine how poor people are throughout the continent and both Central, South, and Central America, you name it. So USAID is something I think that is needed, but there also needs to be some oversight that you have not the functionaries at top who become pure bureaucrats. And again, make sure you do the direct aid to women's program, self-sufficiency. I mean, you got programs that USA have funded and supported to deal with organic or gardening, helping people develop some kind of self-help projects. And again, the organization, I think, is one of those organizations similar to the Peace Corps, provided you don't infiltrate them with some CIA agents or something, but where you got people working directly with residents in those respective countries, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, you name it, wherever there is a tremendous need, and they're invited to help those people with their infrastructure. And the key thing I think that we don't talk about with USAID is the technology transfer. Again, some of these countries and individuals don't have some of the means of, let's say, Cuba, who's really good in the top of the world in medicine and education. We can help in some of those areas by using the best practices through those organizations where you don't have all those situations where it's going to the military. And again, Patrick, what really bothers me is that Rubio, who's probably one of the biggest snakes I ever heard about. One day he was getting slam dunked by Trump about a lot of stuff. Next time he's sucking up vomit from me. But he actually turned around and said, we're going to give $5 or $6 billion to Israel for military hardware. And then, of course, you see how we gave so much money to the military in Ukraine and on. And if you gave all that money to build the infrastructure, help Latinos, African Americans, Asians, Native Americans who've been historically oppressed for 450 years, you would go a great deal of transforming this community. Even the bridges are falling apart. So I think USAID is one of those programs we need to have. And again, when you got somebody who's an addle brain or feed brain or just dumber than a doorknob, that person should understand not only that and all this henchmen is to understand we should be able to direct funding appropriate to the most neediest people in those respective countries. Because if we did that, many of them would not even try to run away as migrants or asylees, because again, some of them have been colonized and brutalized by the historical policies of this U.S. government. So I'm really concerned about that. And I really think that we need to get more of us involved in making sure those international dollars are not used primarily for war materials and subsidizing killing people versus making sure they stay alive. Because again, think of all the years that are lost in our communities and so on. And I think we need to deal with that. I was going to switch up and ask you a different kind of a question, Patrick. And I know that one of the things you work with, and we talked a little bit earlier, you talked a little bit about your experience in education. You talked a little bit about your experience dealing with post-secondary education, obviously at the university, and working for years with the students on different levels. And I know the Department of Education is going to get eliminated. If not today, I saw an email that came across that said that basically they've written up where they're going to try to do that executive order that he does. And he's going to basically say, let's get rid of the Pell Grants, let's get rid of all this stuff, and so on and so on. What's your assessment for someone who's worked for that many years in higher education? What do you think about that? Because I know some of us don't know quite how to make sense of the Department of Education because it's in on the national level versus sometime locally.
Yeah, but before I address that, Jamal, if you don't mind, I wanted to get in on the question of USAID because I think there's another side of it. I agree with what you said, and the need is certainly there in other countries. And I like what you said about all the billions of dollars that have gone to military assistance in the Ukraine, which is a whole other important topic, the issue of white international solidarity, which is the United States teaming up with NATO to protect Europe. I don't see any imperative on the part of the United States to protect Latin America or to protect Africa. And so I don't know well, I know what the preoccupation is with Europe, but it's hardly appropriate. The other side, I think, of USAID that I've witnessed is and you alluded to this, I think, the complicity between USAID and the CIA. Some people believe, I think, righteously, that in many cases USAID is just a surrogate for the CIA. So they may go in and distribute some rice to people or help people with some basic educational needs, but in the meantime, everything that they see and they hear is being reported to the CIA. And so it reminds me of rich people like Elon Musk who might go once a year on Thanksgiving to pass out food, give a free turkey to the homeless or something, while they're in the meantime 364 days of the year they're trying to increase hunger throughout the world. So oftentimes I think the bags of rice and the other help that are given to these developing countries are just a way of keeping the natives from getting restless,
Mm-hmm.
keeping the conditions stable there so that U.S. corporations can do their investment and they don't have to worry about governments asking why U.S. corporations are raping their natural resources.
Mm-hmm. But
So
mentioned
there
that,
is there is a need for massive reform. One little known fact about USAID is that any United States citizen, including you or I, we could write a proposal to USAID to get money to help overthrow the Cuban government
wow.
because Cuba has been designated as a terrorist country or a country that facilitates terrorism. They've been designated as one of our national enemies. And so US citizens are able to get grants to do things like smuggle technology to to people who are trying to overthrow the Cuban government. And there was a famous case of a white guy who tried to do that, and he was caught by the Cuban government and imprisoned. Then the United States had to go through all kinds of machinations to get him out. So that's the other side of USAID. It's a complex topic. In terms of the Department of Education, many of us saw a letter that went out to every school district and every college and university in the United States that was sent by some really ignorant bureaucrat in the Department of Education. In fact, whoever that person is, they should not only be fired, but they should have their high school diploma revoked because it was the saddest example of statements in the area of education with no research or any kind of empirical evidence to substantiate the claims. So the letter basically accuses the diversity, equity, inclusion, the infamous DEI programs of every single wrong in the world, practically. Like anything that's wrong in the world is the fault of DEI, according to this letter. And the letter said in no uncertain terms, if you're overseeing a school district, a college, or university, and you're receiving federal funds, those funds will be revoked if you continue to have DEI programs. That includes things like Black studies, Chicano studies, ethnic graduations, programs such as the model effective programs in California that prioritize service to Black or Chicano students. So my understanding is since that letter went out, they published other things on their website that walk back some of
Hmm.
those initial allegations. And in fact, they have said, okay, yeah, we were wrong that ethnic studies is not a form of discrimination, because that's what they claimed, that DEI programs were a form of discrimination. Again, this is complex, and there's some interesting sides to it. And one of them is the almost complete ineffectiveness, I think, of DEI programs. They're really just a symbolic showing of some sort of trivial affectation of diversity, and they don't really get to the heart of challenging institutional racism. So if a lot of those DEI programs are wiped out by Trump and Elon Musk, it certainly won't be that bad of a thing. And the other part is that if you've ever worked with the federal government in the area of education, as I have, I wrote and was the principal investigator for a federal grant at the University of California, San Diego for over 20 years. So I dealt with federal representatives in the Department of Education. And most of them were arrogant, they were incompetent, they were not helpful, and they wanted to make you feel as a grant recipient that you should be somehow eternally grateful to them and kiss up to them and so forth. And so a lot of them don't deserve a job, and I feel for the people in the field in the colleges and universities and public schools that are doing the work. And needless to say, federal programs like the Pell Grant and student loans that provide financial aid to needy students, those are important. They're critical, and they need to be continued. I think we find ourselves, Jamal, back in the situation that folks like you and I were in during the Reagan administration again, when Reagan wanted to take away federal funding from programs like education and put it into what he called block grants and give those block grants to the states. Now, in California, that would be good because, again, Chicanos and other people of color, we control enough of the political process here that we could ensure that those funds would be allocated to the best places. But then you have a state like Nebraska where people of color don't make up the majority, and they would be basically at the mercy of white bureaucrats that would try to funnel the funding into some other unneeded area.
By the way, Pat, just real quickly, if I remember a conversation we had previously somewhere, you mentioned sometime when we apply for those national grants in some organizations, people get to take some of those monies for their own self-interest. In other words, sometime we have this project in mind, and then I find out that some of the money people take it and you usurp it off the top, and they get like 50% residue from those grant monies. I think you mentioned that. The other thing I found out, and I didn't know this until recently, that sometimes when you apply for those federal grants, when you get new computers and new stuff and the grant runs out, the staff members get to take that stuff home and keep it. So again, there's a certain amount of graft in some departments of education. The one here in Nebraska, I don't know what they've done. I've never really seen them in our community. And again, I'm 70 years old and I've been interacting as an activist or advocate for many years in education and social justice, but I've not seen them play a role on the level they could. And as you said, some of those functionaries are so arrogant and have the brains of an amoeba, or at least as Ernie would say, dumber than a rock. Or excuse me, rock. I didn't mean to insult your rock, but you got situations like that. So it doesn't really help improve the outcomes for many of our students.
Yeah, the issue is really big here in Southern California at institutions like the one that I used to work at, UC San Diego, which is a STEM focused research institution. And what I used to see was faculty who would write these STEM grants for research, doing research in the biotech industry or research in engineering, all sorts of STEM related research. And if they wrote a grant, they would ask for an additional 50% of that grant for what they called indirect costs.
That's pretty
So
high.
if you wrote a grant for $10 million and it was funded, you received an additional 5 million in indirect costs. And what that was supposed to do is pay for the infrastructure necessary to do the research. So you've got faculty, of course, primarily white faculty, that are working in their labs. So the indirect costs pay for the utilities, for the lights, electricity, the water, and so forth, and for the Mexican janitors that clean up the lab, of course. But that doesn't really amount to 50% of the grant. So most of that money ended up going to the CEO of the institution. In our case, it was the chancellor's office. And this was his slush fund. This is how he put together a slush fund for special things that he wanted to do, including his travel, his lavish banquets at his mansion for wealthy donors. So that was a way of wasting taxpayers' money in order to do the things that these very privileged administrators like to do for their own benefit. So I don't think that's a bad idea. The Trump administration has reduced those indirect aids to, I think, a maximum of 15%. And the people here who run these labs and that do the research are asking people like me to write to our congressional representatives and ask them to restore that funding, which is ridiculous compared when you consider that these faculty and administrators never cared at all about racial diversity or equity at their institutions. So they totally ignored the equity issues and the marginalization and the exclusion of people of color at their own institutions. They saw it every day and just turned their backs on it, but now they expect people to stick up for them in their hour of need. I don't think that's going to happen.
By the way, one of the things that come to mind, and I mentioned this yesterday when I was talking to another group, in Nebraska, they just got to eliminate the DEI program. The directors of both programs in Lincoln for the university system as a whole is an African American guy with a PhD from Utah. Never seen him but maybe once in my life. I met with him at the end of his tenure because he was running scared. But I've written to the guy like 3 or 4 times. He never responded. He also said he'd never been to Omaha, but maybe a couple of times engaging with some of the so-called Negro elites. And UNO, they hired a guy. Both these guys are gay. They're homosexuals, blatant, flaming homosexuals. The black guy, I think, is married to a white guy. I'm not sure, but again, that remains to be said who he's married to or his sexual orientation. My criticism as an African American who's been working on race issues, how does someone's sexual proclivities or sexual behaviors trump race of 450 years? And like I say, in my lifetime, I've never heard a person who has different sexual behaviors or practices advocate against racism or oppression. Again, I think we've confused it, and Dave Chappelle has helped us understand the concept of alphabet people. Again, I'm not mad about what you do in your privacy of your home, but when you come to the classroom and you want to produce and talk about certain stuff, if I haven't talked to my kids about the facts of life, you got to be very careful. And I think that's what some people are pushing back on. But my issue is that how they've made most of these programs about he, she, he, they, and they don't necessarily deal with the raw racism and degradations and castrations and lynching of people of color in this country, nor do they want to talk about it. They'll talk about what happened to Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany, but they will not talk about the over 5,000, as Malcolm says, over 10,000 African Americans were lynched. You look at a bad Mexican book that was written about all the Latinos were lynched. We know there are a lot of extrajudiciary killings of Chinese when they were pulling the railroads together. And obviously, we don't want to talk about genocide of what we did with the Trail of Tears. And I've said to one colleague, Trump is nothing compared to Andrew Jackson, for those of us who understand history. And if we can survive Andrew Jackson as people of color, we can deal with this guy. But what's unfortunate, some of us in positions of leadership are sitting on our hands. So when you raise the issue, Patrick, about elimination or not supporting some of these issues, many of us say we've never seen these academic issues in our community. And that leads to another question down the road is how do we, again, address all these issues that are coming up? And here we got to come out of the community as retirees or people who have to put back on our armor and come and challenge the status quo, because these other folks who have the ability and the skill set are sitting there waiting for the crematorians to be fired up against for our people. So it's bothering me. It's getting on my last nerve. And again, we have sleepless nights for many families who are being deported, who've been harassed by these racist police officers, as some of us call them slave catchers in the modern time. But we got to call them out because at the end of the day, an inordinate amount of our people are in prisons and jails, and their lack of housing and shelter and food are becoming worse. And the disparities between people of color, and particularly African Americans and Hispanics and Native Americans, is even at an all-time high. And again, let the data speak for itself. But we at some point have to show a righteous indignation for these clans walking around in these three-piece suits, acting like it's normalized. And again, Trump with his dog whistle self, it's not him by himself, it's that whole cadre of Klan members, spelled with a K versus a C, who are doing some destructive things to annihilate our communities and our families, and again, keep us at the bottom of the pole in this society. But I'm just bothered by the silence of the so-called civil rights and so-called organizations that have been getting money for years, and particularly some of these fake DEI programs. They don't want to say what they is. Again, if you black, you black. If you gay, you gay. You homosexual. But you can't just dress it up with initials. And that's when Dave Chappelle came out and said they're alphabet people.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that was been pointed out about this onslaught against DEI programs is that the Trump administration has not even defined what those are. And again, he tried to cast a real wide net in the first letter that went out, where they're identifying programs and things like Chicano studies, Black studies that have been proven successful. There's bodies of research that show the effectiveness of those educational programs for decades now, and they're putting everything under the sun as DEI, and that's not appropriate. Again, the scholarship shows that you can be inclusive, but you have to differentiate too. And the sorts of programs and services that might serve one population, that's not the sort of thing that challenges anti-racism, and that's the biggest issue that we have to deal with. You talked, Jamal, about some of the things that I know we wanted to discuss today, and one of the important things we've been going back and forth on is that we often see people in the Chicano community doing one thing to fight racism, and then people in the Black community doing another thing to fight racism. But how do we present a united front? What kind of organization and strategy do we need to do to really challenge white supremacy in a much more unified way than what we've seen so far?
You know, Patrick, one of the things I think we have to admit is Black and brown folks and Native folks and so on, we all have our own unique experiences dealing with the racist hegemony of this United States. And so we come from a shared experience. We also come from a unique experience of how we arrived or how we were originated on this continent and so on, those who were indigenous, as we talk of Native folks and so on. But one of the things that I think can help a lot, and it helped me a lot, and I'd like to share that, is my experience of being on the Chicano Awareness Board. I came to learn a lot about Latinos and Spanish-speaking folks and got invited to their homes. The same thing when I helped refugees from Asia. And then when I met some Native Americans who were very much into their culture, and they brought me into the warmth of their communities and so on. And I saw there was a great similarities that we served. We experienced a common level of racism, and when I learned a lot about how do you build friendship and camaraderie. And what I say up front is that in Omaha, we don't have a great deal of Black-Brown coalition because the status quo, meaning white Klan members, and whether it be the FBI, the CIA, the police department, have kept people apart, and they've played each other off like they do in prisons where you got Black and brown folks fighting. And I think the way we have to develop these relationships and do this camaraderie is to look at an issue, bring us around to the table. We collectively have to do that ourselves. We can't expect these gringos or these people who hate us to convene to help us solve a uniform agenda. When I was at Catholic Charities, there was a white guy who was a millionaire, and he was speaking very frankly. I'm not going to drop his name, but he had a basic law, what we call a collection agency, and we were being very honest. He says, Jamal, and he was talking to the whole group too. He says, I am scared when y'all all come together, because it's going to undermine what I'm doing in my work and maybe my income and so on, because you're going to demand reparations. He didn't use that term, but you're going to demand justice on things that have happened historically. And sometimes we as people of color, we play into their hands where we allow people to say disparaging things about people that we should not be saying. Or secondly, when you see, and I was telling, I'm not going to mention her name, Cindy Gonzalez, I slipped. But I says, I was so angry when I saw that picture of that man and his baby daughter laying in the water. And I looked around our community and no one was speaking to this guy is trying to get up to a better life with his family. And he died, him and his daughter. And these airhead brainheads in our community, regardless of their race or color, allowed it like it was another thing. It didn't matter. Their life is not sacred. And years ago, I learned that when I was integrating and talking about the universality, helping people who are oppressed. We got to go back to Jesus of Vaz. We got to go back to Che Guevara's, you name it, where they literally worked for people across the tracks or different racial groups because they had this humanitarian understanding as Malcolm and as Martin Luther King that was an international issue. And I think until we start to help educate our people how we have much more in common, and our common folks is the enemy, just like white folks have united against us and have kept us divided and ruled. And if you look at some of our classes and issues, we don't know each other about each other. We live like 3 blocks away from each other. We know more about European stuff and so on. And I also remember something one day, Patrick, that you said that it still resonates with me. It's like we sometimes worship our language or we worship our religion, but we don't worship the people who are actually the people and the culture of who they are. Language is a tool. Religion is something that people do. But at the end of the day, if we distract that or we pull extract it from the very people who live in our neighborhoods, we won't get to the point of having a united front. And as Malcolm X said so clearly, he was probably one of the most brilliant persons, along with Francis Fanon and some of these other theorists who also got involved. He says, our problem is not, they're better than us. Our problem is unity. If you took the vote of the black, brown, and all these respected groups, and we get some white progressive liberals, there's no way that Trump should have won the election or some of these other neophytes on the front scene. Because right now, we just got to do a better job. And I think it starts sometime, Patrick, one step at a time. And I do believe in integration and bringing people to the same room and talking about what will keep you at the table. How can we challenge ourselves? And I can say, in fact, in my lifetime, I can think of probably maybe 5 or 10 people who, in terms of who feel very comfortable going across racial tracks and being advocates for other group members because they see themselves as part of those folks. How can you be angry about little babies and kids? And we got people who are deporting kids out of schools in this country, picking up in classroom and sending them to places they never grew up in. They grew up here. And then we got these so-called teal tacos and bootlickers and Uncle Toms sitting on the sidelines, sharpening their fingernails and not doing anything about it. And so it bothers me immensely. Even the clergy, they're sitting there when they forget that we have a rich history. For some of us who are not religious, that we circle around the wagons to protect our young and the most vulnerable. And again, if you look at the shepherd, as they talk about in these religious artifacts and Bibles, the shepherd is going to go after that one sheep to help him. But we got these folks getting in their BMWs and their Cadillacs and Lexus and in their early Mucks kind of vehicles, and they ignore us. So I think we're going to have to do more of this group dynamics of building relationship among ourselves so that if somebody in our neighborhood is hungry or in need or being oppressed, we need to make a circle around them to help protect them. Because again, the question we also ask ourselves is, who is your neighbor? And by me being in that environment, I understood it. Go ahead.
One of the things I saw at the University of California, San Diego, that really struck me in terms of unity among people of color was that the faculty of color across ethnic lines, whether Black, Chicano, Latino, Native American, Asian American, they didn't really get together. There was not much of any unity among the faculty of color. Among the staff of color, there used to be a Chicano Staff Association, a Black Staff Association, Asian American Staff Association. The only thing they would ever do together is have a ethnic potluck and share their foods, which is really superficial to say the
Right.
least. But the one segment of the campus that worked together and demonstrated more unity than any other was the students,
Right.
the undergraduate students. So as young and inexperienced as they were, they had enough strategic savvy to be able to come across ethnic community lines and work together to further their mutual goals. Something happens when we as people of color begin to develop our professional credentials and we start becoming climbers, when we start to go up the career ladder and we feel like, man, if I can just make it to that next rung up the ladder, I'll be able to do more for my community. And then you get there and you think, well, I still have to keep my mouth shut because I still got to get up to that next rung of the ladder. And so I saw over and over again that the white folks who ultimately were in complete charge of the institution had a great strategy of appointing sellouts who were people of color at mid levels to keep everybody else down. And so somehow our students are able to supersede that, but it remains a challenge for those of us at the professional level. And somehow
But,
we
but
have to track that.
by the way, Patrick, the other day we were talking with a group of academicians and theoreticians and scholars and so on, and the question came up, I do this, I read these books, I tell my students this and so on. And as the question was evolving, I kept thinking to myself, do we have a matrix of how you define an activist, a person who can do praxis? Because again, it's rare you can have somebody who's a scholar and who can go from being in the academic institution, but also have their feet in the community working with oppressed situations or helping advocate for people who don't have the education and so on. And in our community in Omaha, most of the people, once they get to higher education, they have no use to us. We got lawyers with JD degrees who didn't pass the bar exams. We got people with PhDs who never did research, never wrote an editorial, and so on. So my specific question I'll keep asking myself, and I'm tracking this question not only in asking you, but even myself, is how do you distinguish between how do you determine someone who's a scholar or a theoretician and who's also an activist for the group and people? Because as my grandfather and my father said to me, we don't send you to those places to come there and come back and beat us up and oppress us. We send you there to come back to help us. And that's the universal things that our fathers and mothers say to us. We want you to still be part of our family. So that is the question. What are those criteria you think make a person well balanced around it that they can be in both worlds? Or is that possible? Maybe it's not.
No, I think there is. It is possible. In fact, I know it is because I've seen examples of it. And that's one of the things that I'll always be grateful for, man. That when I was in my PhD program, I had professors that were scholar activists. That's what
Wow.
they did. And even their writing, their scholarship, the research that they did and what they wrote about had an activist dimension to it. They were trying to create change, positive change. Those faculty introduced me something that I didn't even know existed in the field of education, which is called action research, where you do research not just for intellectual curiosity, but you do research specifically, concretely to achieve a goal, to create change, and oftentimes for an anti-racist purpose. So I saw what that looked like. I saw how they not only wrote and did research, but they were also active in local school districts. They might be active in local campus politics. They were always trying to create change. And they encouraged that among us. And you know, at the time that I was in my doctoral program, I didn't really think it was possible to be both a scholar and an activist. And I was not comfortable with the term scholar. I did not want to consider myself a scholar because I thought calling myself a scholar is like saying I'm too cowardly to be an activist. I wanted to be an activist, but it was the faculty who told me very explicitly that you can't do both, man. Like you can be an activist and a scholar. Again, I've seen it happen, and those are the most inspirational role models that I had. I think one of the things that's helpful is for us maybe to just explicitly write down and talk about and reflect on the tools that make a person an activist and what you really need to be able to do that. So somebody in the community, we've seen folks like this, A'Jamal, that they like to get up on there's a person in San Diego that every time there's a TV camera or a microphone, he can't jump in front of it fast enough. But he won't get out there and do the work, you know,
Right.
and he won't write and he has no strategies, he has no plans. So just to talk, you know, talk is nice. Dialogue is important. There's a model that Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, talked about called praxis, where you read theory, you read research, you dialogue about it, you reflect on it, but there has to be a step or a dimension of action. And if you don't have that action, that activism, then all the theory and the research, it goes for naught. Nothing happens.
As you said that, there were a couple of things going back to, I know we spent more time on the university than I thought we would, but I know Nancy Belk, the former chancellor, probably about 15 years ago or more, she got caught embezzling money. She went out on a dinner and paid for it and lied to the president, and they ended up firing her because she was embezzling money. And again, misappropriation might be a better term. For they went out for dinner with a bunch of their friends, and they used a government or the university credit card, and they had alcohol on the bill. And again, normally when some functionary at a high position goes out and does that, they either quickly reimburse it, but some kind of way, I guess they did some investigative reporting to find out there was a certain amount of malfeasance at the university in terms of finances. But I do remember talking with another colleague at the university, and his whining self was that these auditors from the state are too overzealous. But I think the auditor came out and found out that some of the faculty member who were working in the labs and use that extra money they had to spend by the deadline on Nintendo games and Game Boys type apparatus for his kids. And it's like, how do you justify this with university or scholarly research money? And so until you have people like us or people who are from the community having an oversight is what goes on in the universities and these higher institutions, knowing the nature of these personalities, are going to steal it, right? For example, Nebraska Department of Transportation, they found many of their high-level executives were using the agency credit card for gas and filling their tanks up bigger than the capacity of their car. I bet the auditor, who's white, didn't ask them to pay that money back. But we're talking there had to been at least 20 people had those credit cards, and so you used to have this stuff going on. And then when somebody who's low income need a little bit extra food stamps or some basic necessities, they'll give us the fifth degree, and it's just part of the challenge we face. But going back to this thing of education, some kind of way along, we have to figure out how to put that matrix together, Patrick, and talk about what we consider as the criteria of helping our people, because service learning is a farce. They've done nothing in this community that I'm aware of except come out with that great white savior. In the history of Omaha, Nebraska, I don't think they've ever had an African American staff member or Latino male on their staff. They've had everybody on the staff, but you won't see men in that department. Again, service learning is a whole different concept. But again, what good is service learning if you come out here preaching to us and bringing out these altered genetic seeds that don't do anything to help transform our community, and obviously don't talk about poverty and social justice and service learning? Because you look at some of the people they got being the leadership, they have no track record, and most of their leadership are white women who will have certain proclivities of being afraid of black men and afraid of black families and afraid of Latino men and just knowing how to come into North and South Omaha. And I suspect the same thing is replicated across the country. But we really got to do a better job of making sure when folks get public funds, they come back and help our communities. We're getting close to the end, but we got a couple other questions, comments we want to talk about, Pat.
Yeah, let's talk about something that we've mentioned, I think, again, and we're talking about the Trump administration. And one of the questions, I really like doing these historical parallels because it just it takes me back to some of the things that we've lived through before. And as you said, sometimes that gives a small comfort, but also a chance to revive strategies that we used back in the day when they were successful. And so I'm sure you are also a fan of this great musician, the late great Gil Scott Heron,
All right.
who wrote the song "B Movie" right after Ronald Reagan was elected president. And you know, first line in the song was, "The first thing I want to say is mandate my ass." And he was talking about how the Reagan administration was trying to claim that they had a mandate. Well, Reagan did win in a landslide. Donald Trump did not win in a landslide. He won a very narrow victory over Kamala Harris, even in the battleground states. So this notion of a mandate seems to imply, at least coming from from Trump, that those of us like you and I who voted against him, all of a sudden now we have no rights. It's like we're not. It's like we lost our citizenship. We don't have the right to demand anything anymore, or to receive any benefits, or even entire states like California that voted majority for Harris. Like all of a sudden, the things that are important to us, we're not entitled to those anymore.
Right.
So this is a farce, and it makes me think that as as people in the United States, we really need to question what democracy is, because the notion seems to be if you vote for a presidential candidate and your candidate loses, like you're out of it, man. Like you don't have any ability to demand your rights any longer. There are thousands of people in California that like equity, that reject racism and reject white supremacy. And we should be allowed to implement the policies, even sanctuary cities, that we think represent our priorities. If not, then I think it's time for states like California, let us secede from the Union. Let
Right.
us leave the United States. Give us back our tax dollars and leave us alone. Let us run our programs and services the way that we want. It's interesting that Donald Trump says, on one hand, that an important issue like abortion should be returned to the states. Let the states decide whether abortion is legal or not. Well, let the states decide whether DEI is available and accessible and legal even. And let us decide if equity programs and ethnic studies is available and if it's legal. Because the current notion of democracy is really dysfunctional, and we're not going to exist as a country if it continues. Now, I think one of the interesting facts that people have noted about the Trump administration is that in many ways it seems to be the end of the empire. That everything that he's doing is the indication that the United States empire is crumbling, and that's probably a good thing. So maybe it's time for the experiment of the United Nations to end and figure out some other way to restructure the country where we don't have people like you and I. We don't have to live with folks that represent these red states, and we can raise our children to live in peace, and we can have our communities in peace, and we can have our lives the way that we deserve.
You know, you raise an important point about a mandate because in Nebraska, Deb Fischer, who is a Republican who just won her Senate seat back again, she almost got beat by a guy out of nowhere, Connor. And what's unfortunate, Deb Fischer, to my knowledge, she was a no-name state senator. How she got there, because she got millions of dollars of land, I guess, in the Homestead Act. She's a billionaire, obviously, in Western Nebraska. And again, in Western Nebraska, it's 70% white Republican vote and all that. But I noticed that when she was campaigning, every day she had a picture or two of some white organization she was with or place. And I never seen a person of color in any of her pictures until recently. There was some black woman she got because I used to comment about, you're a U.S. Senator for the whole state of Nebraska. And it's like President Obama said when he became the president, he says, even though I know that you didn't vote for me, I'm still the president of all the people in the country. And some of these rednecks and Klan members and neo-Nazis and white supremacists act like they only have to serve one group, even though they represent our state or they represent our city or whatever. And the issue I raise that, Patrick, because at the end of the day, you alluded to something very important. Why are we paying taxes when we can't get jobs in city government or county government? They've had very few African Americans or Latino administrators in county governments in Douglas County over the years. And then we have to go and fight through consent decree to get on the police force. Again, you only need a high school diploma to be a police officer, but they make good money, $80,000 a year starting pay today in Omaha. But again, back in the day, they don't talk about those white police officers who got those mock exams or real exams from their fathers and uncles and people who was on the force. When we tried to get on the force, they had all kinds of burials. So if we're using government funds, we need to have proportional representation of those various groups as the best as we can. I'm not saying take somebody who's a dog catcher and make him an engineer, but there's some of those jobs that they give to their white friends through cronyism, nepotism, and this whole patronage system that again supports white folks. And there's no excuse for the juvenile justice system that have all white staff members in each one of those areas. Or you go to the probation office, they're all white, and they got one token black person who's afraid of her shadow. And they don't speak out. Again, it's no accident that our kids and our families, men and women, end up disproportionate in prisons over crimes sometimes they haven't committed because we got incompetent attorneys or white lawyers who hate us and despise us, like some of these school teachers. And if they didn't, we'd be much more inside those systems succeeding, but we're not. And again, it goes back to the things we've been talking about. We got
Yeah,
about 5 minutes left, and I
it's
wanted
another
to
thing
give
that
you a chance to go over some other
Scott
stuff.
said. Gil Scott said that white people love nostalgia. And that's one of my observations about Omaha right now. That it's stunning to me. I've been gone from Omaha for 35 years now, and it's stunning to see that such a high percentage of the population is now people of color. So those old days when every one of those public service jobs and those high-paying government jobs were for whites only, that has to end. That's not appropriate given the demographic and makeup of Omaha now.
One of the things that I wanted to touch base where we left and so on is we talked a little about all these issues that I guess there are some people who watch this show or program to say, what do we if we had a magic wand, what are the solutions we would have to address many of our issues if we could come with some concretization, as Paulo Freire uses those terms, where you decrystallize or you deconstruct some of these complex theories and ideas. But if we had a magic wand of three things, what will we do, or how will we help solve some of the issues that we're talking about today, Patrick?
Wow, that's hard to imagine having a magic wand. The Chicana scholar Gina Garcia talks about what she calls freedom dreaming. Like how do you conceptualize a college, for example, or a university that truly does not exclude people of color, doesn't marginalize people of color. So for my bias, as an educator, the magic wand would certainly transform education institutions so that um, we would have institutions where people of color can construct the kind of conditions that we need to thrive.
Hmm.
And we can teach our students real, truthful content that prepares them for the reality of their community. And if our community thinks through a collective lens, where education is not just to get a good job and get a career and turn your back on where you came from, then the magic wand would make education look a lot different than what it is now. Same thing with representative government. I think that would be another thing. As you've talked about, we don't have anything close to representation in our government, and so it's not. I'm not talking about just people that look like us, but people that again really have our community's needs at heart and are there really to represent the best wishes and needs of the community. So um, I really doubt the capacity of this country to ever really be inclusive. And so, as I said, I think ideally we have to look toward a different model of society where the country is broken up either on the basis of ethnicity or perhaps political orientation. And so people think, well, that's nuts, like how would you do that, and what would that look like? And I would just say, look at the way that the United States is configured right now with 50 states. Why 50 states? And why is every state a different size? And why is it a different shape? It makes it so arbitrary. So it's existed this way for over 200 years, but I think it's time to go back to the drawing board. In many ways, Jamal, the country doesn't make any sense right now.
Wow.
I
Wow.
feel like I feel like it's as if we're in a dysfunctional marriage where one spouse is psychologically and physically abusing the other spouse, and that spouse is just trying to keep the family together. But we all know from experience that sometimes in those situations, the best thing is divorce.
Right.
The best thing is to end the union and let people go their separate ways. So I just don't have faith in the continued structure. Again, it is really the crumbling of an empire. I think what Trump is doing and what his followers are doing are sending a message that we better figure out as people of color how we're going to govern ourselves and what we're going to do, because their vision of the United States in the future certainly doesn't include us unless it's us being in a subservient position. And I don't think that we're in a position where we're going to accept that anymore.
Wow. One of the reasons me posing that question, I came at it a little bit different when I posed it because I thought, number one, reparations for all the historical injustice they've done to us as they've done in Nazi Germany did for the Jews. So there's millions of billions of dollars that we should get to help deal with the trauma in that, number one. Number two, we need to have credible messengers. We need to have credible messengers along our systems helping us in systems because, in other words, if we are at the table, it's going to be a different kind of a cake being made, and you have to have that. And the third thing I think we have to have, and I think we don't put a lot of attention to, is demographics and research and data. Because right now, we got the popular media talking about how things are getting better. We look at Beyonce, Michael Jordan, these rich billionaires, and people, oh, look at them, or we got a black president. But at the end of the day, if you look at the data, and I saw this years ago, and I don't know what the numbers is for Native Americans or Latinos, but I do know for African Americans, they said it would take us like 4 generations or 5 generations to equal parity with whites if we had this great program to make us go forward. But right now, the gap is becoming even greater because there's no excuse for somebody to be a billionaire or the richest person on earth if a system is fair. And so I believe very strongly we need to tax folks because, again, if it doesn't prolong the life of the meekest among us, then what good is 3 extra cars or whatever? So, but I also think, going back to your comment, is that I have this fatalistic view also, and I'm not sure what to say about it because I do believe in hope. And I hope that those of us who are involved in the struggle, Patrick, don't give up. As Ernest Chambers once said, when Father Time catches me, I'm hope in motion. So again, as we stand on the shoulders of our grandfathers and our grandmothers and our mothers and fathers, they didn't give up on us. And so as much as you have a prediction that looks more realistic today than what I have, I still have to say that I wanted to fight for those grandchildren and great grandchildren who are not yet born. But on that note, I really appreciate you sharing with us a lot of the views of what we need to be talking about. And obviously, you're not going to get this on traditional TV or local media because they filter people like you and I when we speak truth to power and so on. So appreciate you being here today as always, and hope we'll continue to kind of throw out some heavy light because you're not going to get in a traditional oppressive racist institution that practices sexual centric politics or basically believe in deviant behavior that's related to keeping people oppressed. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and as Che Guevara said, hasta siempre.
Hey, on that note, we'll call
We
it a
will
day.
win. We will win.
Take care, my friend.